Imagine being a complete loser, no talent, no future, but suddenly you're thrown 10 years back in time with a powerful system and full knowledge of what's to come. With this second chance, our protagonist rises from rock bottom, overcomes every obstacle, and becomes unstoppable. Let's dive into this thrilling journey. Scorching sun that bore down on the city, a bus made its way through the streets, delivering passengers to their destinations. The heat was so intense that the temperature inside the bus felt unbearable, as if the passengers were roasting alive. It was a blistering summer day, and the entire country seemed to have transformed into a sauna. The passengers, however, were soon distracted, turning their confused gazes in a particular direction. He too noticed the commotion and heard the murmurs of confusion. What they all saw was a small green figure standing ahead, clutching an axe. The figure grinned menacingly and without hesitation began a brutal massacre. The passengers, in sheer terror, were powerless to defend themselves, succumbing to the horror before them. As screams filled the air, one individual tried to call the police, but before any action could be taken, he was swiftly killed by the goblins. The chaos unfolded as the goblins viciously attacked another passenger, leaving everyone paralyzed by fear. He knew what would happen next. In mere minutes, everyone on the bus would meet the same gruesome fate. It was nothing short of a slaughterhouse where both adults and children were slain indiscriminately. 80% of Seoul's population would perish while witnessing this brutality. As fear gripped him, he asked himself in confusion, "Can I really survive this?" But deep down, he knew the answer. He was a player without talent. In the year 2028, in the Jongno-jiu district, a place famous for holding civil servant exams, he ordered food and found a place to sit. Nearby, two people were engrossed in a conversation about their recent exam failure. They lamented their poor results and discussed giving up on their studies to try their hand at business or something else. He quietly found a comfortable seat. His name was Kim Hyuk-jin, a 30-year-old man who had spent the last 7 years repeatedly preparing for the civil servant exam. Just an ordinary person, he had no talent for becoming a player. 10 years ago, after the gates opened in Seoul, a disaster of extraordinary magnitude swept through the city. Some survivors awakened as players, but Hyuk-jin, despite his dreams of becoming one, soon realized he had no talent and gave up. His only focus now was to pass the civil servant exam. As he ate his food, he listened to the surrounding conversations. People were talking about Gwaktan's video, uploaded the day before. They marveled at his fighting prowess, dubbing him God-tone. They envied his talent and success. In contrast, ordinary people like them had to struggle to become civil servants to make a living. The topic shifted to Hyuk-jin, as someone mentioned his past. Long ago, he scored 67 talent plates on the player aptitude test, only to find that all of them were closed talents. Talents typically close when someone turns 20, and now, at 30, he had none. Hyuk-jin didn't dispute this. He had no hope of becoming a player. 7 years ago, he took the aptitude test hoping for a miracle, but the results were devastating. Not only did he have just one active plate, but it was a far cry from being called talented. He didn't know why the head of HR at the Player Association personally delivered the results to him, but the man had offered words of encouragement, knowing Hyuk-jin was studying to become a civil servant. Hyuk-jin's life, devoid of exceptional talent, was a stark contrast to that of a player, whose life was filled with wealth and popularity. For Hyuk-jin, the dream of becoming a player was a luxury he couldn't afford. He returned to his shabby residence and continued studying, determined to change his future. As night fell, he listened to an interview with Ma Sang-yeon, a prominent player who had survived the disaster 10 years ago. Ma Sang-yeon stressed that effort mattered more than talent, but Hyuk-jin, filled with doubt, wondered if his efforts were truly enough. Despite everything, Hyuk-jin resolved not to dwell on such thoughts. If he had talent, he would have been awakened as a player by now, chosen by a guardian, and basking in wealth. But that wasn't his reality. Later that night, he opened a letter from his late mother. Sometimes he felt that everything, his mother's death, his sister's leukemia, was his fault. Despite his best efforts, he had failed 3 civil servant exams, and now, full of self-doubt, he questioned what he lacked. His body shook violently as these thoughts consumed him, and he felt a deep loneliness. Just as midnight approached, a spark of bluish light appeared. The next day, Hyukjin woke up confused, realizing he was late for a temporary evaluation. He rushed out, barely managing to catch his bus. As the bus arrived, he felt that something was different, something unsettling. As the vehicle made its way through the city, Hyukjin overheard passengers talking about random things, like an idol group making a comeback. But his mind was focused on his studies, specifically on the catastrophic event that had taken place 10 years ago. His concentration was broken when the passengers became agitated. Fog began to engulf the outside, making it impossible to see. Then a pungent, sewer-like smell filled the air. Alarms blared on everyone's phones, alerting them to an emergency, and when Hyukjin looked at the message, he was stunned. The date read April 27, 2018, 10 years in the past. In that moment, he realized that the current events mirrored the catastrophe from a decade ago. If this was real, and if he continued toward Jongno-gu District, there was a 97% chance he would die, as 145,000 out of 150,000 people had perished during that disaster. The sky darkened suddenly, and Hyukjin came to a shocking realization. He had gone back in time. Not only that, but he now knew the future. Just as this realization hit, a system notification appeared in front of him, instructing him to prepare. The countdown began. The tutorial will begin. A terrifying gate appeared above Jongno-gu District, marking the start of the first tutorial. Citizens could only stare at the gate in confusion, unaware of its purpose, until monsters began emerging from behind it. These creatures, known as dungeon monsters, flooded the city without warning. Thousands were slaughtered during what became known as the Week of Calamity, later called the Open Beta or Tutorial. In Jongno-gu District alone, 150,000 people perished, leaving only a 3% survival rate. That day was forever remembered as the worst in human history. However, from the devastation, beings known as players emerged. These players swiftly conquered the monsters, and over time, the dungeon that caused the disaster in Jongno-gu was gradually cleared. Raids on various dungeons were recorded, and battle footage of the players was used to create virtual dungeons, aiding humanity's recovery from the catastrophe. He memorized all the recorded raids and completed virtual dungeons hundreds of times. In fact, it was rare to find someone who knew more about the incident than him, even though he knew he could never become a player. Despite this, he kept playing in every virtual dungeon because back then, he was the best in the world. Suddenly, a system notification appeared, informing him that the tutorial was about to begin and instructing him to prepare. These notifications came along with the catastrophe he had only studied in theory, leaving him emotionally confused, wondering if he had truly gone back in time. Suddenly, the bus he was on jolted violently, startling the passengers. Confused, they asked if the bus had hit something. Panic spread as the passengers couldn't see anything outside, fearing they would be late for school. Hyukjin also felt a surge of panic, but calmed himself by reminding himself that this event had already happened. He soon realized that no one else seemed to hear the tutorial notification, meaning he was the only player present. Knowing he had to use everything he'd learned to survive, he decided to analyze the situation first. But suddenly another system notification appeared in front of him. A nameless observer had noticed his actions and begun to take interest in him. Surprised, Hyukjin recognized the name. Nameless Observer was one of the Guardians. Then, out of nowhere, the Nameless Observer awarded him the Open Beta bonus, which left him confused as he hadn't completed anything yet. As far as he knew, this bonus was given to the infamous Ranker Guardian. Guardians are beings that observe and influence players, bestowing them with bonuses that can determine a player's fate. They exist in a dimension above the players and use aliases to communicate with them. The system reappeared, and through the Open Beta bonus, Hyukjin was given the Calm Observer's Eye. Though still confused by the situation, Hyukjin suddenly felt calmer, as though viewing everything from a detached, third-person perspective. The system countdown to the start of the tutorial quest had begun, only 10 seconds remained. Meanwhile, the bus driver apologized to the passengers for the earlier incident, explaining that the fog was too thick to continue driving. The passengers, worried about being late, decided to disembark and run. Frantic, Hyukjin warned them not to leave and to lay low if they wanted to survive. Just as the countdown finished, a gate appeared near the bus, causing the passengers to freeze in confusion. When the countdown hit 0, a beautiful woman stepped out of the gate, introducing herself as Sinia, the intermediate administrator. She informed them that they were now in the tutorial. A system notification appeared before Hujin, stating that the quest required them to survive in the tutorial field for 1 day. They couldn't leave the field during the quest, and the difficulty of future quests would be determined by how many people survived. Hujin, though silent and filled with doubt, now knew for sure that he had indeed traveled back in time to the moment of the great catastrophe. When Sinia spoke, the passengers assumed she was part of some movie production and weren't in the mood for such a joke. They demanded answers, but Sinia simply repeated that they had to gather strength to survive the tutorial. Before anyone could react further, a human corpse suddenly crashed into the bus, causing the passengers to scream in terror. Panicking, the passengers tried to call the police, thinking someone was throwing corpses to frighten them. Hujin, however, recognized this as a strategy of the goblin army, which was attracted by the sound of screams and movement. The first goblin attack had begun. As the goblins climbed onto the bus, one passenger frantically demanded the driver open the door, but the others knew that doing so would only lead to disaster. The goblins outside were massacring people, and Hujin knew that directly facing them would be suicide. Goblins were physically stronger than humans, and even if they were weak later in the future, there was no way he could defeat them during the tutorial. Eventually, the goblins breached the bus. The passengers panicked and ran, despite Hujin's repeated warnings to stay still. It was too late. Nobody listened to him. The system notification appeared again, and the nameless observer seemed intrigued by Hujin's actions. Hujin, surprised, opened his status window to see that his stats were much higher than expected. Just then, the glass of the bus shattered and a goblin climbed inside. The passengers fled in fear as the goblin chased them down, slaughtering them one by one. With no hope of escape, Hujin lay still in a pool of blood, tricking the goblin into believing he was dead using his calm observer's eye skill. Hujin knew there were safe zones in the tutorial field, and one of them was inside the bus. To stay safe, he had to remain perfectly still. Though every move could trigger a failure condition, he remained calm, believing it was thanks to the bonus from the Guardian. The goblin inspected him closely but found no sign of life, allowing Hujin to survive. If his knowledge of the future was correct, the first goblin attack would last for about 10 minutes, and if he could survive 5 more minutes, he would make it through. Just as he was holding his breath, the system notification reappeared, this time from a different guardian, the courageous Lion King. The Lion King gifted him a powerful elixir, and a potion with a green liquid appeared in his hand. It seemed that the Guardian was eager to witness Hujin's courage. That's just the beginning of this epic journey. Our protagonist has only started to tap into his full potential. In the next part, we'll see him face even greater challenges as he continues to rise. Stay tuned for part 2, where the real battle begins.